Our speaker today, Mr. Anthony E. Dixon, PhD. He's a native of Fort Valley, Georgia. In 1994, he received a Bachelor of Science degree in History and a minor in African American Studies from Florida A&M University. In 2001, he received a Master's of Applied Social Science from Florida A&M University with a concentration in history. In 2007, he received his PhD from Indiana University's History Department, where he majored in the African diaspora. His studies included African American history and African history, and a minor in library science, special collections, and archives. His publications include Up From Incarceration, Florida's Negro War, and a timeline of the African diaspora experience. And I know there's been others he'll mention when he come up as well. Currently, he is the founder and president of Archival and Historical Research Associates, LLC, field director for the Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network, and adjunct professor of history at Florida A&M University. And of course, he is a friend of the society. He's been our speaker for our annual meeting on at least 2 other occasions. And this is the 3rd occasion. And it's not like baseball with 3 strikes and you're out. 3 strikes and you're very welcome. But I want to say that Dr. Dixon has also given interviews in a lot of projects that we worked on over the years. And if you go to the park and go to view the video in the video room, he's a part of that as well. And he's on the video there. But I wanted to make sure to let you know that he is a friend of society. He's actually been our speaker, and he does quite a bit of research in that area that we are interested in. So we're going to continue to bring him forth and hopefully kind of drain all the knowledge we can out of him about what he knows about what we want to know about. So without further ado, I want to introduce to some and present to others Dr. Anthony E. Dixon.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
I want to make a couple of changes there. I am no longer an adjunct at Florida A&M. I'm now located in Orlando, Florida. I'm an adjunct at Valencia College now. Also, in that move, I'm no longer the field director for the Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network, but I still work with them when called upon. Tonight I want to take a few minutes to talk to you about a resilient group of people. And I want to start at the very beginning because that's the best place, because I was always told. So our story actually begins in the 16th century, when our first Africans were brought in, and La Florida tried its first hand at migration and immigration into La Florida. And we began in the 16th century at Galdape, which is present-day Sapelo Sound, Georgia. Here we have our first instance of settlement by the Spanish. It's important to know that with the Spanish, the English, and the French, they all failed at their first experiment at settlement. For the Spanish, it was Galdape. For the English, it was Roanoke. And for the French, It was Fort Caroline, just outside of present-day Jacksonville. At Caldape, though, we see our first inklings of Maroon societies. Here, the Guale Native Americans convinced the African enslaved individuals to help with a rebellion. And so when the Guale Native Americans attacked the settlement, the Africans set fires on the inside, and it ended up burning and destroying Caldape. And we find that many of those Africans left and absconded into the wilderness with those Guale Native Americans. So we say that that is our first instance of Florida Maroons. And this is the first case where we see Africans going out and absconding away from European presence and living in the wilderness. We fast forward on to the 17th century, and we start seeing competition between the Spanish, the British, and the French in terms of settlement and who's going to actually take over North America. The Spanish, of course, laid claim from present-day Miami all the way to Newfoundland, Canada. And this was, of course, threatened by both the French and the English. Neither one of them acknowledged that boundary. And so we start seeing fierce competition between the Spanish and the English. And early on, the Spanish understood that the English were there to impart plantation society. And that plantation society was how they were going to thrive and how they were going to survive in North America. So they began to look at ways to thwart the plantation society in the English colonies. And they quickly understood that the growth of plantation society was directly held into how they can have their labor and how this free African labor supply equaled how they were going to not only survive but advance. And that the advancement of English plantation society was directly involved in how well they were able to bring in this stable African labor supply. And so they began to look at ways to slow this growth down. By the time we get to the late 1600s to 1680s, the Spanish started noticing more and more numbers of Africans absconding and leaving and running away from plantation society. And so they actually sent a message to the king, first to the governor and then to the king. And they asked them, what do you want us to do with these runaways that they continuously come from the English plantation society? Now, we got emails today and things of that nature, but you have to imagine back then in the 1600s, it took 5 years for a reply to come from the king. And so the king finally comes up with the idea of the Edict of 1693. And in this Edict of 1693, the king basically says any African that absconds away from plantation society can come into La Florida and live free. And so we understand now, as much as we talk about the Underground Railroad going north, the first Underground Railroad actually came south, and it came into La Florida, particularly by way of the St. Johns River. Now, we notice specific origins that were coming from the West Coast. And these origins these people began to meet up, and they began to create a collaboration along the English Plantation Society. And this happens because of the way the agrarian society was built. Rice quickly became the primary product. And in rice country, rice is grown in lowland swampy areas. These lowland swampy areas bring mosquitoes. Mosquitoes bring yellow and jaundice fever, and Europeans were highly susceptible. So many of the European owners were absentee owners. They lived further up into what we call upper country, away from the fields. And what this did was it allowed these Africans to create their own society. They created their own dialect. The society we call Gullah, the dialect we call Geechee. And it is a mixture of these West African languages. As time goes on, more and more began to abscond down the St. Johns River. It gets to the point where the English are asking the Spanish to return them. But they're going through phases of war. So anything that is going to aid the English, the Spanish are against. So instead of absconding to them, they actually increased. They allowed even more Africans to come. And so we started creating Maroon societies up and down the St. Johns River. The Spanish then decided to work with these Africans, and they created Fort Mose. Now, Fort Mose was also a necessity for them. St. Augustine was under constant attack during these international wars. Most of the wars were fought overseas, but every now and then it was spilled over into the quote-unquote New World. So they would fight over possessions in the Caribbean, and they would fight over possessions in North America. And so in doing so, they needed these Africans to help protect the city of St. Augustine. And so they created Fort Mose. Now, what you see here is Fort Mose on the right, and then the dwellings for many of the Maroon societies in the wilderness. What we do understand between both of the communities is that plantation society had its imprint. If you notice in Fort Mose, there's the linear outline of the quarters. This resembles the linear outline of the slave quarters in English Plantation Society. We also notice this same linear outline within the Maroon societies. And so there was a time when they would come up into these Maroon settlements, and they were able to tell whether or not they were Native American or whether or not they were African by this linear design. And again, it's important to understand that this linear design comes from the slave plantation and slave quarters. So we understand that the Gullah was not only a mixture of West African language and culture, but it also included plantation society as well. and that English language was also a part of the Geechee dialect. As we move forward into the 18th century and into the 1700s, we start seeing more and more Native Americans being in closer proximity to these Africans and to these Gullah people in Maroon society in particular. Now, of course, there's a heavy influence of Spanish society at Fort Mose. And there's been the conjecture there whether or not the African descendants at Fort Mose were in fact free or not. But we contend that they were free people living under Spanish authority. And that although they did have to accept Catholicism, and then they did have to do other things as part of Spanish society, it was considered more of a freedom type situation than captivity. And they were always free to go and live into Maroon society if they wanted to. They were expected to, of course, defend St. Augustine, but they were given freedom of choice whether or not they could stay or go eke out their own existence in the wilderness with other Africans and African descendants. And so what we start seeing is a change in the Gullah dialect itself. They start adding more and more Native American words. And so we start changing it into what we call the ASC, the Afro-Seminole Creole language. And here you see a depiction between the English, the ASC, and traditional African languages, and a bit of Gullah dialect. As we go and move forward in the 18th century, we start noticing that there are more and more Native Americans that are coming into La Florida as well. They are not happy with plantation society either. It is encroaching upon their land, and many of them are also being taken in the earlier days and enslaved themselves. And so we start seeing many of the smaller bands, the Yuchi, and smaller bands of the Yamasee coming down into La Florida. But then we start seeing a major shift in the Creek organization. Now, the Creeks were normally in what we call the eastern part of Alabama, from the mountains all the way down to what we call the triangle where Alabama, Florida, and Georgia meet. Now, they were divided into what they call the Upper Creeks and the Lower Creeks, or the Northern Creeks and the Southern Creeks. The problem is the Southern Creeks began to accept plantation society. They began to accept the growth of the English plantation system, even when it began to encroach and come across the border set by international law between the Spanish and the English. And more importantly, they began to accept the ideologies of slavery. And they began to buy and sell Africans and African descendants as slaves. And so what happens is the Northern Creeks begin to question the Southern Creeks. What are you doing? What are you doing taking people and buying and selling enslaved people? we take and enslave people when there's war. And of course, we keep the women for ourselves, keep our own numbers up. But we don't take and buy and sell people, and we certainly don't say that their children belong to us as well. And so there's this great schism between the northern Creeks and the southern Creeks. And so the northern Creeks began to push their way down into La Florida as well. And they began to commingle with these smaller bands of Native Americans, such that by the 1750s, they are known by their own name. And that name is the Seminoles. Seminole actually comes from the word Semolina and Cimarron, meaning renegade. This is why you see Florida State, they say they have renegade as their calling card as well, because this is one of the earlier names and meanings for Seminole. And so as they began to develop, they still develop more with a Creek background. They are smaller bands, they are a homogenized group of Native Americans, but the vast majority are Creek. So a lot of Creek culture can be found in Seminole culture. As we move on into the 1700s, we start seeing shifts. For a brief period of 20 years, the British actually take La Florida. And as was mentioned earlier by Brother Jackson, many of the inhabitants, the Spanish inhabitants of Fort Mose, they leave. Not all. Some inhabitants, particularly the African inhabitants, they go out and live in the wilderness with those that are already out there dotted along the St. Johns River. And so we start seeing a shift in the number of Africans being brought in. When the British take over for the 20 years, from the 63 basically to 1780s, early 1780s, they bring in plantation society. And they divide Florida into two pieces, East Florida and West Florida. And when they do that, they force those Maroon societies that are along the St. Johns River and into the southern parts of Georgia along the coast, they force them out west. And they go out westward in present-day Georgia and then back down into Florida. And this is how Tallahassee and Gainesville gets populated. It actually gets populated by runaways and Native Americans before the English and the Spanish. And so what we find is that when this begins to happen, Florida has two distinct cultures. An East Florida that is dominated by plantation society. The governor of East Florida even makes agreements with Georgia and South Carolina that they aren't going to compete with them by selling rice, that they're going to sell the secondary product, indigo. And so many of the plantations between St. Augustine and present-day Jacksonville are indigo plantations. And out west is highly populated with Africans and Native Americans. And then you go further west and you have Pensacola, which is the last stronghold of the Spanish. So you have a real multicultural atmosphere in the late 1700s. And it is well known that there are free Africans that live and thrive between Gainesville and Tallahassee. Now, of course, one other major schism happens during that period of time as well, and that is the quote-unquote Americans come. Right? We said between 1760s and 1780s, right? So here comes 1776. And so the British are forced out of North America for most part. They lose their strongholds in La Florida as well. The Spanish, it's funny how things work. The way that they got La Florida was in the 1760s, they took Cuba. The British took Cuba and they gave the Spanish a choice. You can have Havana or you can have La Florida, but you can't have both. So of course, the Spanish gave up Florida and kept Cuba, present-day Cuba. Then in the 1780s, the Spanish turned around and did the same thing. They went and took Bermuda. And they told them, you can have your plantations in Bermuda, or you can give us La Florida back. And so they gave La Florida back. And at the same time, they had no choice because the Americans were calling for their independence as well. There was no way that they could fight on all these different fronts. But what we do notice at that point is that there's such a large influx of Africans that come in, that African descendants are primarily enslaved on the East Coast, while you have Africans that are primarily free on the west side of Florida. And this continues on into the early 1800s. Now in the 1800s, America is upset. And it's not really all of America, it's plantation society. Plantation society is upset because at the end of the War of 1812, something happens dramatically. And we always talk about the War of Independence, but I have to remind my students all the time that America got its independence with two wars, not one, but two. It took two wars. It took the War of Independence, but it took the War of 1812 to get established. The rest of the world did not recognize the United States until the War of 1812. And even though they didn't win the war, it was the big brother against the little brother. When the big brother or the big guy fights the little guy and it ends up in a tie, then you give the winner to the what? To the little guy, because the little guy held his own. And so this is what happens with the War of 1812. America holds her own. But within that war, we have what we call the Patriots' War. And that was a war over these international ports. We talk about Charleston, we talk about New York, we talk about Philadelphia and Boston. But in actuality, there were ports that were more important at that time. And those were the ports of Tampa, Panama City, Pensacola, Mobile, Biloxi, and New Orleans. Because these were the international ports. These were the ports that were still going to the Caribbean. And the Caribbean was still outproducing the Americas as a whole. And so it's funny that the Patriots and the British are fighting over these ports, but most of these ports belong to the Spanish. It's the audacity of the British and their descendants that they will fight over ports that technically didn't even belong to them. And so they fought over these ports. And of course, Andrew Jackson comes out as an American hero because he wins the Battle of Biloxi and then he takes New Orleans. And so the rest of the ports then fell under the United States. And so what happens when the British are finally forced out of these ports and out of North America, they do one last thing. They look to their allies that helped them, the Native Americans and the blacks that helped them during the War of 1812 and during the Patriots' War. And they left them a fort. And it became known as the Negro Fort. It's about 65 miles outside of Tallahassee on the Apalachicola River. And at this fort, this sent shockwaves throughout plantation society. Because now Native Americans and blacks were going to a more formalized agreement. They were getting together more. But more importantly, a fort meant something. A fort meant that you were on your way to your own settlement. Settlement meant that you were on your way to your own colony. And the idea of runaways having their own colony sent shockwaves throughout plantation society. And so they sent word to Andrew Jackson that the Negro Fort had to be destroyed, that it could not stay. They even went so far as to say the Negro Fort, the presence of the Negro Fort, would forever hold plantation society from becoming its greatest ability, with its greatest ability. Because as long as the enslaved blacks knew that there was a colony of free blacks, they would always run. And they would always go to it. And they would always support it. And that plantation society would never reach its maximum potential. And so Andrew Jackson agreed. And without any authority from the Secretary of War, he leaves New Orleans and he comes into La Florida and he attacks the Negro Fort. Now, there have been two different stories now on how the Negro Fort was destroyed. The oldest story is that it was hit by a hot shot, meaning they took a cannonball and they put it in fire, and then they fired the fiery cannonballs into it so that it would burn down everything that it landed on. And that one of the cannons actually hit the artillery and blew the entire fort up. Then there's the story that the hot shots were brought in, but they actually landed also, and they simply massacred everyone at the fort. There are two different stories that go there, and from the earliest writings, either one could be true. Because we have word there from some of the survivors that they did come on land, but the fire is the main thing that they talk about. So we think maybe that once the fire hit and began, they still came on land and massacred who was left. Now, Andrew Jackson then, a week later, turns northward, and he goes into one of the larger Native American settlements called Fowlestown, and he destroys Fowlestown. Now, as Florida historians, we have another conjecture there. Many Florida historians have said when he destroys Fowlestown, that begins the First Seminole War. However, historians like myself say no, it is when he destroys the Negro Fort that he starts the First Seminole War. Because even the Native Americans themselves are recorded as saying that they were going to get revenge for the Negro Fort. Because they had small settlements outside of the Negro Fort as well. They utilized the Negro Fort as a place of trading. So it was held by both groups as an important piece of society. And so that society, I want to take just a minute to talk about. They began with a basic understanding that everything was matrilineal. That in order to belong to the Seminole Native Americans, you had to belong to a clan. In order to belong to a clan, it was matrilineal. So, if your mother was a Seminole Indian, then you belonged to a clan, and you were considered a Seminole Indian. But if it was your father, then you were still considered in the Maroon society, and you were still considered black. And so they had an agreement in which they had 3 fields. Native Americans would grow crops in one field, blacks would grow crops in another field, and then they'd have a third, what they call tribute field, which they grew crops together. But the proceeds of those crops went to the Native Americans for protection, because it is the Native Americans who could trade for guns. Blacks could never trade. They would have to go to plantation and steal guns and steal ammunition and steal any other supplies that they needed. So in order for this protection, they would give this tribute field. And so what we see is actually two nations growing within one nation. And so what happens at the end of the first Seminole War, we see a dramatic change in Florida. The First Seminole War ends in late 1818, goes from about 1816 to 1818. In 1819, the United States gets Florida ceded from the Spanish. So we can see a direct line between the First Seminole War and Florida becoming an American territory. Now, what happens is he pushes, when I say he, I mean Andrew Jackson, he pushes most of the blacks and Native Americans out of the Gainesville and Tallahassee area, down into the Tampa area, and over into the Orlando area. Now we see Lake County and Orange County now is nice and pretty with all the pristine lakes, but you have to imagine it in the 1800s. It was uninhabitable. It was swampy, lowland. And so many of them declined the agreement. Also, many of them were able to convince the British to help. And so the British come back and help by sending transportation. And they are transported, just like from Fort Mose, they were transported with the Spanish to Cuba. They are transported out of the western part of Florida into the Bahamas. And they relocated in what we call Red Bay, Bahama. Now, what we see then, at that junction, when they leave North America and they go into the Caribbean and into the Bahamas, we then see the Gullah language and the Gullah culture becoming a diaspora of its own. And this is the first chance where we see it goes from Gullah to ASC, and then from ASC out of La Florida and out of Florida into the Bahamas. And they take some of the same culture with them. So the same way you see the basket weaving techniques in Low Country in South Carolina, you see basket weaving techniques, same basket weaving techniques in the Bahamas. And it's particularly on Andros Island, which is considered the agricultural island for the Bahamas. So they're still out there isolated. In fact, they're so isolated that they keep most of the language, the Gullah and the ASC language, intact, more so than even South Carolina. And so we are able then to begin tracking the Gullah language and the Gullah culture through these Maroon societies from Florida out to the Bahamas and then out west. They come back in the 1820s, late 1820s, early 1830s. They tell the United States, we cannot live down there. We refuse to live down there. And what has changed is that now the blacks have gone into a formal agreement, a more formal agreement with the Native Americans. So we stopped calling them Florida Maroons, and we began to call them Black Seminoles. And so a second Seminole War is then fought. That war goes from 1835 to 1842. It is still the longest, deadliest, and costliest Native American war fought by the United States. I know we hear a lot about Geronimo and Sitting Bull, but it is actually the Black Seminoles and the Seminole Native Americans who put up the strongest fight. And we now know that it was primarily because the United States government declared that those blacks in the company of Native Americans shall be returned to slavery. And so they were fighting for their freedom. While Native Americans were fighting to keep the land and stay in Florida and resist the Indian removal policy, Black Seminoles were fighting for their freedom. And so we see the development, a full development of two nations within one nation. And so we hear a lot about Geronimo, we hear a lot about Sitting Bull, but you don't hear as much about Osceola. And it is because Osceola primarily fought with Black Seminoles. Most of the men in his band were Black Seminoles. He considered them the best fighters. And we now know, and we knew then as well, that it's because they were fighting for their freedom. And so in 1842, before we get to 1842, in 1838, something significantly happens. The United States government gives up to a certain extent. They say, okay. Those blacks in the company of Native Americans can immigrate out west and return their freedom. Now, this is very important because even the first general, his name was General Jessup, Thomas Jessup, he sent word back to the Secretary of War that this is not an Indian war. This is a Negro war. And basically, the United States government has been duped by plantation society into going on a large slave catching expedition. And we are losing. He says it, and we are losing. And so, many blacks began to stop fighting, and they agreed to immigrate out west into the Arkansas Territory, which is now Oklahoma. But back then it was considered the Arkansas Territory, but it's present day Oklahoma. Now, the war ends in 1842. When the war ends in 1842, we have two major things that are going on. In the larger scheme of things, we see that the Second Seminole War then paved the way for Florida to become a state. The war ends in 1842. Florida becomes a state in 1845. And back then, of course, you had to wait on a partner. And so Florida's partner was Iowa. Iowa came in as a free state. Florida comes in as a slave state. And so we can see how each war tends to the development of Florida. Now, as far as the Seminole Nation is concerned, it causes a schism. Many Native Americans are upset that the blacks quit fighting. And so the black Seminoles had to remind them, no, we always stated that we were fighting for our freedom. Whether we get our freedom here in Florida or we get our freedom out west. And it is also because blacks were doing most of the negotiations with the United States government because they were the ones who spoke English the best. And it is the black Seminoles who understood that they could never defeat the United States government. What they could do is beat them for the best terms. And so that's what they did. They tried their best to get them to let Native Americans stay, but Andrew Jackson and his Indian removal policy was strict on that. They had to move. And we understand now that he got all of those ideas about Indian removal from his time in La Florida and in Florida. He took his experiences with him to D.C., and that's how he came up with the Indian removal policy, because he understood firsthand the stark difference between Native American culture and European culture. And the main thing in that was the idea of property rights and land usage. That has always been the basic difference between Native American culture and European culture. Since the Pilgrims first step foot, as well as the Spaniards, the idea of land use and property rights. Native Americans never believed until they were forced to believe that someone could actually own the land. That you do not own the land, you share the land. And so, what we then see is that when they get out west, they have a problem. Many of the Native Americans are upset. Many of the Native Americans still want the same agreement with the third tribute field. And so many blacks, the black Seminoles are like, no, we're all free now. We don't need to pay for protection anymore. We negotiated all of that for us. But many of the Native Americans still expected that tribute field. So black Seminoles then went to Nacimiento, Mexico, and then to Brackettville, Texas. and we see the culture still being pushed on and pervade in those areas. Each year in Brackettville, they still have their community ties, they still have their meetings. Those from Oklahoma that stayed in Oklahoma, stayed on the reservation, still come down. But we still have those basic problems. And they carried all the way over into present day. When the United States government recently gave Native Americans, finally gave the reparations that they said they would, Black Seminoles looked for their portion of the money. Seminole Native Americans did not give them any of the money. And so when they went to court, the United States government sided with the Native Americans. Although you still had Black Seminoles that were living on the reservation, that had been living the same as Seminole Native, their counterpart, they were denied the money. So you see the Seminole Hard Rock Cafe and all of that good stuff. But the Black Seminoles never received their money, any money. And that still goes back between the rift that they had. And I'm happy to say now things have gotten better and they began to do things with Black Seminoles out in Oklahoma and in Brackettville, Texas. But this is recent. This is very recent. Because when I was doing my research in the early parts of 2004 to 2007, I couldn't get the Native Americans to even talk to me. They didn't want to talk. They didn't want to aid in any other research. But now they support research. They support Black Seminoles much better now. And I'm glad to see that that relationship has kind of moved forward. Now, the last part, I'm going to jump back on you. Sorry to do it to you. But I'm going to jump back on you. And that's the Third Seminole War. I want to talk briefly about the Third Seminole War, and then I'll wrap it up. The Third Seminole War occurred primarily in South Florida. Particularly around Lake Okeechobee and down into the Everglades. This was when Florida decided to advance into South Florida. And so the last remnants of the Seminole Nation had been pushed down into the Lake Okeechobee area and down into the Everglades. And so they fought this war in order to open up South Florida. Now, they never completely eradicated the Seminole Nation, but they lowered the numbers enough that they felt that they could not impede any progress that they wanted to make. And so this occurred from 1855 to 1858. So South Florida was supposed to be developed in the mid-1800s. However, of course, Civil War came, and Civil War changed everything. And I tell my students all the time, Reconstruction lasted 12 years for the government and for the United States. But Florida didn't finish Reconstruction until the 1890s. Florida is very slow to develop. It was a very slow developing state. I have to remind my students all the time, Los Angeles is about 150 years older than Miami. So that kind of gives you an idea of how slow developing Florida actually was. But in doing so, the last of the Seminoles were dispersed. And black Seminoles then that were left of the remnants from the Third Seminole War were forced into American society. And so we still have black Seminole descendants here in Florida. But it takes the older generations to really know the basket weaving techniques and some of the ASC language. Most of that is still pretty much kept intact, like I said, in the Bahamas and with the older generations in Texas and Oklahoma. Thank you.
Thank you.